What happens when the criminal underworld's most feared architect mistakes a lethal weapon for fragile glass? Arthur Blackwood, a ruthless syndicate boss accustomed to breaking people with a single glance, thought he was just bullying another defenseless waitress at a dimly lit dive bar in Chicago. He wanted to humiliate her, challenging her to step into the ring, expecting a pathetic display of tears and apologies. But Arthur had no idea he just handed a pair of gloves to a suspended, underground, bare-knuckle champion who had put heavyweights in the hospital. This is a story of shattered egos, blood, and a twisted, dangerous romance. Arthur Blackwood was not a man who tolerated imperfections. As the undisputed head of the Blackwood Syndicate, controlling the lucrative shipping lanes from the port of Chicago down through the sprawling Midwest, his life was meticulously ordered by extreme violence and exorbitant wealth. He was a man who operated in the shadows but lived like a king, demanding absolute obedience from every soul in his orbit. On a particularly miserable, rain-soaked Tuesday night, Arthur sat secluded in the back booth of the Rusty Anchor, a decaying dive bar in the South Side that he technically owned through a labyrinth of corporate shell companies. He was flanked by his most trusted lieutenants, Elias and Cole, going over ledger discrepancies from the docks, his mood as foul as the weather outside. Waitress Clara Hastings wiped her brow with the back of a tired hand, trying to ignore the ache in her lower back. She despised the Tuesday night shift. The air inside the bar was thick, suffocating with the smell of cheap, stale cigar smoke, spilled draft beer, and the oppressive, desperate scent of men trying far too hard to be intimidating. Clara kept her head down, her movements mechanical and precise. She wore a faded, standard-issue black apron over a simple, slightly oversized white button-down shirt, her dark raven hair pulled back into a messy utilitarian bun. To the rough patrons of the Anchor, she was nothing more than a ghost, a nameless nobody, serving overpriced, watered-down whiskey to criminals. They didn't know about the heavy Everlast gym bags hidden beneath the floorboards in her tiny, drafty apartment. More importantly, they didn't know about the worn newspaper clippings from 3 years ago, hidden in a lockbox, detailing the meteoric rise and sudden, violent suspension of the underground boxing phenom, known only in the deepest fighting pits as the Iron Ghost. Clara had walked away from that life after putting a corrupt promoter in a coma, a man who had tried to fix her fight. She was laying low, surviving on minimum wage and tips, burying the violent monster inside her under stacks of dirty plates and polite smiles. As Clara approached Arthur's secluded table, balancing a heavy tray holding 3 crystal glasses of Macallan 25, a sudden, violent shove from a belligerently drunk patron behind her sent her stumbling forward. Clara's legendary, ingrained athletic balance saved her from hitting the sticky floor, her core tightening instantly to stabilize her body. But the tray tilted just a fraction of an inch too far. A single heavy amber drop of scotch splashed directly onto the lapel of Arthur's charcoal grey, bespoke Brioni suit, a garment worth more than Clara's annual rent. A horrifying silence descended upon the booth. Elias and Cole went completely, terrifyingly still, their hands inching instinctively towards the concealed weapons under their jackets. The ambient noise of the bar, the clinking of glasses, the low murmur of illegal deals, the jukebox playing a sad country song, seemed to vanish, completely sucked into the terrifying vacuum of Arthur Blackwood's icy blue glare. Arthur slowly, deliberately, looked down at the dark, spreading stain blooming on the expensive Italian silk blend. He let out a slow breath, his jaw clenching, before raising his piercing eyes to meet Clara's. "Do you have any idea how much this jacket costs, sweetheart?" Arthur's voice was barely above a whisper, yet it possessed a lethal frequency that cut through the room like a freshly sharpened razor blade. Clara didn't flinch. Her heart rate remained a steady, calm 60 beats per minute. She carefully placed the tray down on the wooden table, her face a carefully constructed mask of practiced, retail indifference. "I'm sorry, sir. A customer bumped into me. It was an accident. I can pay for the dry cleaning out of my tips." Arthur let out a low, humourless chuckle that sent a shiver down the spine of everyone within earshot. "Dry cleaning? You couldn't afford the threads used to stitch the buttons on this jacket if you worked in this pathetic dump for a decade." He leaned forward, the smell of expensive, musky cologne and raw, unadulterated danger radiating off his broad shoulders. "You're going to get on your knees right now, right here on this filthy floor, and you're going to try to clean it with your own hands. Then you're going to beg me to let you keep your miserable little life, let alone your job." Cole snickered loudly, a cruel, grating sound. Elias cracked his heavy knuckles, a clear threat of impending physical violence. Clara looked Arthur dead in the eyes. The submissive, frightened waitress act cracked, just for a microscopic fraction of a second, revealing the apex predator buried beneath her calm exterior. The air between them suddenly crackled with a strange, highly charged tension. "I said I was sorry," Clara replied, her voice dropping an octave, losing all of its customer service sweetness. "I'm not getting on my knees for you, or anyone else. Send me the bill." Arthur stood up slowly. He was 6'2" of solid, gym-honed muscle, a former brutal street brawler who had literally murdered his way to the pinnacle of the city's syndicate. He loomed over her, fully expecting her to finally cower, to cry, to break under his overwhelming physical presence. Instead, Clara subtly shifted her weight, grounding her feet into the floorboards, her hips perfectly aligning, her shoulders dropping a fraction of an inch, the microscopic, unconscious preparations of a master striker preparing to throw a devastating right hook. Arthur, blinded by his own towering arrogance, didn't notice the micro-movements. He only saw a stubbornly stupid girl who didn't know her place. "You have a lot of nerve," Arthur hissed, a dark, twisted smile playing on his lips. "I like breaking nervous things. Let's make a deal, waitress. You think you're tough? You think you can stand up to me without shaking? There's a boxing ring in the basement of my private warehouse on 9th Street. We step in. 3 minutes. You survive 3 minutes in that ring with me without begging for mercy. I'll let the suit slide, and I'll hand you 50 grand in cash. You lose or you refuse." Arthur leaned in so close she could feel his breath. "I lock the doors to this bar, and I burn it to the ground with you inside it." The ride to Arthur's warehouse was conducted in a suffocating, hostile silence. Clara sat in the back of the sleek, blacked-out Lincoln Navigator between Elias and Cole, who spent the entire 20-minute journey polishing their handguns and making crude, laughing remarks about how quickly she was going to end up in the intensive care unit. Clara simply stared out the tinted window at the passing neon lights of the Chicago skyline, mentally compartmentalizing her environment. She wasn't Clara the waitress anymore. She was slowly, methodically unearthing the iron ghost. Arthur's warehouse wasn't merely a storage facility. It was the sprawling, heavily guarded nerve center of the Blackwood operations, complete with a state-of-the-art combat arena where his top enforcers trained, sparred, and frequently settled deadly internal disputes. The underground gym smelled of stale sweat, expensive leather, and the faint, unmistakable metallic tang of dried blood. When Clara arrived, escorted tightly by a smirking Cole, there were already 30 of Arthur's heavily tattooed, hardened men, crowding around the professional-sized, brightly lit canvas ring. Word had spread rapidly through the syndicate's ranks. The men were drinking imported beer, holding thick wads of cash, making loud, raucous bets on exactly how many seconds it would take for the boss to make the arrogant little waitress cry. Clara walked into the blinding fluorescent light, wearing cheap, oversized grey sweatpants and a plain white ribbed tank top she had pulled from her locker at the bar. She looked incredibly small, fragile, and entirely out of her depth amidst the towering mountains of criminal muscle. Arthur was already inside the ring, shirtless, his deeply tanned torso a terrifying roadmap of knife scars and intricate Russian Mafia tattoos denoting his kills and rank. He was hitting focus mitts with his head trainer, the resounding, explosive cracks of his heavy punches echoing sharply off the cold concrete walls. "Look who actually showed up!" Arthur taunted loudly over the thick velvet ropes, his chest heaving slightly, glistening with sweat. "I honestly thought you would have tucked your tail and skipped town. Give her the waiver, Cole. Let's make this legal before I make her bleed." Cole roughly shoved a heavy wooden clipboard and a cheap pen into Clara's hands. "Sign it, sweetheart. Read the fine print. It says whatever happens in there, you can't sue the boss, and the syndicate is not responsible for your funeral costs. Not that you'll be able to hold a pen to sign a hospital form afterward anyway." Clara took the pen. She didn't even glance at the legal jargon on the paper. She just signed it with a quick, aggressive, illegible scrawl, tossing the clipboard onto the concrete floor. Her heart was now beating at a perfectly steady, rhythmic pace. The familiar, overwhelming sensory input of the gym, the rough texture of the canvas, the sticky resin, the smell of athletic tape, was deeply intoxicating. It felt like coming home after a long, agonizing exile. "Gloves," Clara demanded quietly, holding her hands out. Elias scoffed, tossing her a pair of heavily worn, bright red 16-ounce sparring gloves. "Need a man to help you lace 'em up, little girl? Don't want you breaking a nail before the boss breaks your jaw." Clara completely ignored his taunts. She walked silently to a worn wooden bench in the darkest corner of the gym. From her deep pocket, she pulled out 2 fresh rolls of professional, heavy-duty athletic tape she had insisted on bringing. The men in the room were entirely distracted, busy laughing, drinking, and cheering for Arthur's warm-up routine, completely missing the terrifying, sacred ritual unfolding in the shadows. Clara didn't just casually wrap her hands. She engineered a pair of lethal weapons. She moved with blinding, practiced speed. She anchored the tape around her wrists, locking the delicate carpal bones into an immovable cast. She layered the fabric meticulously over her knuckles, creating thick, reinforced ridges designed to maximize impact and protect her hands from the devastating force she was about to unleash. When she finally slipped the oversized red gloves on, she didn't ask for help. She secured the Velcro straps herself, using her teeth and her free hand, a difficult trick she had mastered years ago, in the brutal, unsanctioned fighting pits of underground Philadelphia. Arthur stood dead in the center of the brightly lit ring, bouncing lightly, arrogantly on his toes, his hands down by his waist. "Whenever you're ready to bleed, sweetheart," he yelled, drawing another deafening roar of laughter from his gathered soldiers. Clara approached the heavy steel stairs leading up to the ring apron. She didn't hesitate for a microsecond. She grabbed the top rope, pressing it down forcefully, and stepped through the taut strands with a fluid, incredibly economical grace that made Elias, a seasoned street fighter himself, pause and narrow his eyes in sudden, unexplainable suspicion. Clara walked purposefully to the opposite blue corner, tapped her padded gloves together twice, and finally looked directly at Arthur. She wasn't looking at his handsome, arrogant face. She wasn't intimidated by his scowling eyes. She was coldly, analytically looking at his collarbone, his solar plexus, the wide, unprotected space between his lazy guard. Her mind was instantly downloading his stance, calculating the exact kinetic equations needed to dismantle him. He was an orthodox fighter, standing far too heavy on his lead front foot, his chin floating slightly exposed, clearly relying entirely on raw, brute power rather than refined technique or footwork. He was a brawler, a dangerous one, but a brawler nonetheless. And to a master technician like the Iron Ghost, a brawler was nothing more than a heavy bag that bled. 3 minutes on the clock, Arthur commanded, pointing to the digital timer on the wall. He tapped his own gloves together mockingly. "If you try to run away, I will chase you down and hurt you worse. If you fall, stay down. Ring the damn bell." Ding, ding. The sharp metallic sound of the bell echoed sharply through the cavernous warehouse. The rowdy crowd of mobsters instantly fell into a hushed, heavily anticipatory silence, leaning aggressively against the ring apron, their eyes wide, eagerly waiting for the brutal slaughter to commence. Arthur walked forward slowly, dominating the center of the ring, his hands lazily held at waist level. He clearly wasn't taking the woman standing across from him seriously. He viewed her as a pathetic toy, a momentary distraction to relieve his anger. He threw a slow, incredibly wide, mocking left jab towards her face, intending to just aggressively tap her nose, make her eyes water, and force her to flinch back in sheer terror. Clara didn't flinch. She didn't blink. As Arthur's massive fist traveled through the air, Clara moved. She executed a flawless textbook parry, brushing his jab aside with a microscopic movement of her right glove, redirecting his kinetic force harmlessly over her right shoulder. At the exact same fraction of a second, capitalizing on his extended momentum, she pivoted sharply on her lead foot, deeply burying her weight into the canvas, and closed the distance between them in a blur of terrifying speed. Crack! The sickening sound was like a wooden baseball bat violently striking a wet, heavy sack of flour. Clara's left hook, loaded with the torque of her entire lower body, dug viciously, perfectly, and relentlessly into the exact center of Arthur's unprotected liver. Arthur's arrogant blue eyes bulged grotesquely from their sockets. The breath left his lungs in a sudden, violent, involuntary rush. His muscular arms dropped uselessly to his sides as a massive, paralyzing shockwave of absolute, unadulterated agony ripped through his entire nervous system. He gasped, a horrific, wet sound, stumbling backward awkwardly, his brain completely and utterly failing to process what had just happened to his indestructible body. The silence in the massive warehouse was absolute. It was a suffocating, terrifying vacuum of sound. 30 hardened, murderous criminals stared in complete, mouth-hanging disbelief as their terrifying, invincible boss, the man who had strangled rivals with his bare hands, folded over at the waist, coughing aggressively, his face turning a dangerous shade of pale grey. Clara didn't step back to admire her handiwork. She didn't smile or taunt him. She immediately stepped back into the pocket, her guard high, tight, and impregnable, returning instantly to a perfectly balanced, coiled fighting stance. "Keep your hands up, Arthur," she commanded, her voice terrifyingly cold, entirely devoid of the meek waitress's tremor. "Or this is going to be a very, very short 3 minutes." Arthur's handsome face violently contorted into a terrifying mask of pure, unbridled rage and humiliation. He tasted bile and sharp copper in the back of his throat. His liver screamed in protest, but his ego roared louder. "You little bitch," he snarled, abandoning all pretense of playing a sadistic game. He lunged forward recklessly, throwing a massive looping right overhand punch fueled by pure anger, intended to knock her head clean off her delicate shoulders and end the embarrassment immediately. It was a catastrophic mistake. It was a telegraph so obvious, so ridiculously wide, that Clara could have read its intentions in the Sunday morning newspaper. She smoothly slipped inside the massive punch, bending her knees slightly, letting his tree trunk of an arm fly completely harmlessly past her right ear, with Arthur's momentum carrying him dangerously forward, leaving his entire left side completely overextended and exposed. Clara unleashed the Iron Ghost. She fired off a devastating, mechanically perfect, 3-punch combination, faster than the human eye could track. Right uppercut, driving upward like a piston, crashing devastatingly into his floating rib. Left hook, snapping violently horizontally, connecting perfectly with his unprotected jawline. Right straight, firing directly down the pipe with the full force of her pivoting hips, landing dead center on the bridge of his aristocratic nose. Pop, pop, crunch. Blood sprayed in a sudden, fine crimson mist, beautifully illuminated under the harsh, buzzing fluorescent lights. Arthur's head snapped back violently, his eyes rolling momentarily white. His legs, thick and powerful as they were, instantly lost their structural integrity. He crashed backward onto the unforgiving canvas like a felled redwood timber, the massive impact of his heavy body visibly shaking the entire ring and the men leaning against it. "Boss!" Elias screamed in sheer panic, completely dropping his clipboard and rushing frantically to the apron, his hand scrambling for the Glock tucked into his waistband. The rest of the men erupted into absolute, terrifying chaos, pulling out heavy firearms, shouting over each other, pure pandemonium breaking out as they realized their king had just been overthrown by a girl who poured their drinks. Arthur lay flat on his back, staring blankly up at the blinding ceiling lights, his nose visibly shattered and deviated, thick, dark blood pooling in his mouth and pouring rapidly down his chin. He gasped for air, his vision swimming with dark spots. Through the haze of pain and concussion, he looked over at Clara. She was standing perfectly still, looming over him in the neutral corner. Her expression was completely unchanged. She wasn't heavily out of breath. She wasn't shaking with adrenaline. She wasn't scared of the 30 guns currently being drawn in the room. She looked down at him with the cold, detached professionalism of an executioner simply waiting for the final order. Arthur coughed violently, painfully rolling onto his side, spitting a thick, dark mixture of blood and saliva onto the white canvas. He held up a shaking, heavily tattooed hand, weakly gesturing to his panicked, armed men. "Stop!" Arthur bellowed, his voice raspy, wet, and echoing with uncharacteristic pain. "Stand down! Put the damn guns away!" The weapon slowly lowered, but the suffocating, highly combustible tension in the room remained completely unbroken. Arthur slowly, agonizingly pushed himself up to a seated position, wincing as his bruised ribs screamed at him, wiping the streaming blood from his mouth with the back of his leather glove. He looked up at the waitress, really, truly looked at her for the very first time. He saw the perfect, balanced stance. He saw the dead, hyper-focused eyes of a seasoned killer. He felt the terrifying, world-shaking power lingering in her small hands. "Who the hell are you?" Arthur breathed, his trademark arrogance completely, utterly obliterated, instantly replaced by a dark, dangerous and overwhelming fascination. The metallic tang of blood was thick in the air, a stark contrast to the sterile, buzzing fluorescent lights of the underground gym. Arthur Blackwood, the undisputed king of the Chicago underworld, remained seated on the blood-spattered canvas. His chest heaved as he stared up at the woman who had just dismantled him in less than 45 seconds. Clara Hastings didn't offer him a hand. She didn't offer an apology. She simply reached up with her teeth, tore the Velcro strap of her left glove, and let it drop heavily to the floor. She repeated the process with the right. The bright red leather hit the concrete with a dull, hollow thud that echoed in the deafening silence of the room. "I survived 3 minutes," Clara said, her voice flat, devoid of adrenaline or triumph. It was a simple statement of transactional fact. "I want the 50 grand in cash, small bills unmarked, and I want to go home." Elias, still gripping the grip of his concealed weapon, stepped forward, his face flushed with a dangerous, volatile mixture of rage and profound confusion. "You arrogant little—" "Elias!" Arthur barked. The sharp command immediately followed by a wet, agonizing cough. He pressed a hand against his side, feeling the distinct, unnatural grinding of a fractured floating rib. "Shut your mouth and stand down. That's an order." Arthur slowly climbed to his feet. It was a degrading process, lacking his usual feline grace. His bespoke trousers were stained with his own blood, his nose violently pushed to the left. He walked over to the ropes, leaning heavily against them, his piercing blue eyes never leaving Clara's face. There was no anger in his gaze now. There was only a terrifying, ravenous curiosity. The monster inside him recognized the monster inside her. "Get her the money, Cole," Arthur wheezed, spitting another mouthful of crimson onto the floor. Cole hesitated, glancing around at the stunned faces of the syndicate enforcers. "Boss, you can't be serious. She just assaulted you in front of the whole crew. We have to make an example out of her." Arthur turned his head, the terrifying icy glare returning to his eyes, momentarily cutting through the haze of his concussion. "Did I stutter, Cole? She won the bet. We are criminals, not liars. Get the cash." 10 minutes later, Clara walked out of the heavy steel doors of the warehouse into the freezing Chicago rain. She carried a heavy leather duffel bag containing exactly $50,000. She didn't look back. She walked 4 blocks, took 3 different buses, and finally arrived at her dilapidated apartment building in the Lower West Side, a brick structure that smelled permanently of boiled cabbage and damp rot. She locked the deadbolt, slid the chain into place, and sank to the floor, her back against the peeling paint of the door. Her hands were finally shaking. Not from fear of Arthur Blackwood, but from the intoxicating, terrifying high of the violence. The Iron Ghost was awake, and Clara knew it was going to be nearly impossible to put her back to sleep. Across the city, in a penthouse overlooking the glittering skyline, Arthur sat shirtless on a leather medical chair. An underground syndicate doctor, a man named Dr. Harrison Fowler, whose license had been revoked a decade ago for malpractice, was meticulously setting Arthur's shattered nose. "You're going to have severe bruising, Mr. Blackwood. 2 fractured ribs on the right side. Minor concussion," Dr. Fowler mumbled, applying a sterile dressing. "Whoever hit you knew exactly where to strike to bypass your musculature. It's surgical precision. Heavyweight power in a featherweight frame." "I know," Arthur replied softly, wincing as the doctor taped his ribs tightly. He dismissed the doctor with a wave of his hand. Elias stepped out from the shadows of the expansive office, holding a thick manila folder. He looked deeply uncomfortable. "Boss, I pulled every string we have. Bribed Detective Miller down at the 14th Precinct to run her fingerprints off the glass she dropped at the bar." "And?" Arthur asked, pouring himself a neat glass of bourbon, despite the concussion protocol. "Clara Hastings is a ghost. No record, no family, no digital footprint. But the prints triggered a buried file in the organized crime database out of Philadelphia. It was redacted, heavily buried. Cost me 10 grand just to get Miller to peek at it." Elias tossed the folder onto Arthur's mahogany desk. "She's not a waitress, boss. She's the Iron Ghost." Arthur leaned forward, ignoring the stabbing pain in his ribs, and flipped the folder open. Inside were grainy, low-resolution photographs of Clara from 3 years ago. Her hair was shorter, her eyes wilder, standing over unconscious, massive men in dirt-floor basements. She fought in the darkest, most illegal bare-knuckle pits on the East Coast, Elias explained, his voice laced with reluctant awe. "Undefeated. They say she put men twice her size in the ICU, but 3 years ago, she vanished. Turns out, a notoriously ruthless fight promoter named Reginald Hayes tried to force her to take a dive in a high-stakes bout against a Russian heavyweight." Arthur's eyes narrowed. Reginald Hayes. The name was a poison pill. Hayes was a vicious debt collector and promoter tied directly to the Kozlov Bratva, a rival syndicate that had been bleeding Arthur's shipping operations dry for the last 8 months. "What did she do to Hayes?" Arthur asked, tracing a finger over a photograph of Clara's blood-spattered face. "She didn't take the dive," Elias said grimly. "She broke the Russian's jaw in 3 places. When Hayes confronted her in the locker room with 2 armed guards, she put the guards in wheelchairs. And Hayes? She beat him so severely he was in a medically induced coma for 6 months. He lost an eye and permanent motor function in his left hand. The Bratva put a $500,000 bounty on her head. She fled to Chicago, to hide." Arthur leaned back, a dark, wicked smile slowly spreading across his bruised face. The pain in his ribs suddenly felt like a gift. The universe hadn't just handed him a humiliating defeat. It had handed him the ultimate weapon. "She's hiding from the Russians," Arthur murmured, his brilliant tactical mind already spinning a deadly web. "And the Russians are currently breathing down my neck for control of the South Port." "Boss, you can't be thinking of employing her," Elias warned, stepping closer. "She's a liability. If the Kozlovs find out she's in our city, let alone under our roof, it's an all-out war." "It's already a war, Elias," Arthur snapped, standing up, the bourbon warming his blood. "The Kozlovs are hosting the decennial crucible next month." Elias paled. The Crucible was an archaic, brutal underground tournament held by the ruling crime families. Each syndicate entered one champion. No gloves, no rounds. Only one man walked out. The winning family claimed absolute jurisdictional rights over the disputed territories for the next 10 years. Arthur had been desperate to find a fighter capable of beating the Kozlov's current champion, an absolute monster named Grigori, who had killed his last 3 opponents in the ring. "Grigori is 250 pounds of pure psychopath, Arthur," Elias argued. "She's 130 pounds soaking wet. It's suicide." "You saw what she did to me," Arthur countered quietly. "She doesn't fight with brute strength. She fights with physics, leverage, and absolute, sociopathic ruthlessness. She's going to fight in the Crucible for us." "And what makes you think she'll agree to that?" Arthur closed the folder, his eyes cold and calculating. "Because I'm going to give her a choice. Fight for me and win her permanent freedom, or I make one phone call to Reginald Hayes and tell him exactly which dilapidated apartment the Iron Ghost is sleeping in." The next morning, Clara was jolted awake by the unmistakable, terrifying sound of her apartment door being splintered off its hinges. She rolled out of bed with lethal fluidity, her hand instantly diving beneath her mattress to retrieve the heavy, loaded 9mm Glock she kept there. She dropped into a crouched, defensive stance, aiming precisely at the fatal funnel of the bedroom doorway. Heavy, expensive Italian leather shoes crunched over the splintered wood of her hallway. "Put the gun down, Clara," a smooth, raspy voice echoed through the cheap drywall. "If I wanted you dead, I would have thrown a fragmentation grenade through your window, not ruined a perfectly good pair of Ferragamos kicking your door in." Arthur Blackwood stepped into the frame of the bedroom door. He looked entirely out of place in her miserable apartment, dressed in a flawless navy blue 3-piece suit. The bridge of his nose was heavily taped, and purple bruising bloomed fiercely around his eyes, but his posture was completely dominant. Cole stood behind him, a submachine gun resting casually against his chest. Clara didn't lower the gun. Her finger hovered dangerously over the trigger, her breathing perfectly controlled. "You have exactly 3 seconds to leave before I put a hollow point through your left kneecap, Blackwood." Arthur smirked, completely unfazed. He reached into his breast pocket, slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a single, glossy photograph, tossing it onto the foot of her bed. "I think you'll want to hear my proposition first, Iron Ghost." Clara's eyes darted to the photograph. It was a recent surveillance shot of Reginald Hayes. He was in a wheelchair, his face heavily scarred, a glass eye replacing the one she had ruined. He was speaking to heavily armed Russian thugs outside a Philadelphia nightclub. A cold spike of dread, pure and absolute, pierced Clara's stoic armor. The gun wavered for a fraction of a millimeter. Arthur caught the micro-expression. He's awake, he's angry, and he has the entire Kozlov Bratva actively hunting you, Arthur said smoothly, stepping fully into the bedroom. "My men intercepted a communication last night. They know you're in Chicago. They just don't have the exact address. Yet." "What do you want?" Clara demanded, her voice losing its icy edge, replaced by a terrifying, desperate intensity. She finally lowered the weapon, realizing a gunfight here would only draw the police, which would inevitably draw the Russians. "I want to make a trade," Arthur said, stepping so close she could smell the rich espresso and expensive cologne on him. He looked down at her, a strange, dark electricity arcing between them, born of mutual violence and unspoken respect. "The Kozlovs are bleeding my territory. In 3 weeks there is a tournament, the Crucible. It settles territorial disputes between the syndicates. I need a champion, a ringer they will never see coming." "You want me to fight for a Mafia boss to settle a turf war?" Clara let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I left that life behind because of monsters like you." "I am a monster," Arthur agreed easily, leaning down, his face inches from hers. "But I'm a monster who can offer you the one thing you can't buy with the 50 grand I gave you. Immunity. You fight for me. You beat Grigori. I win the Southport. In exchange, I use the leverage gained from the victory to force the Kozlovs to formally wipe your slate clean. I erase the bounty. You get your life back, completely free of shadows." Clara stared at his bruised face, her mind racing through the tactical realities. If she ran, she would be looking over her shoulder for the rest of her life. Hayes would never stop. He had the resources of the Russian mob, but fighting Grigori? The man was a mythical beast in the underground circuit, known for literally snapping necks in the ring. "And if I refuse?" she asked quietly. "Then I walk out of here," Arthur said coldly, "and I leave a tip with the Kozlov's local lieutenant on my way back to my estate. They will be here in 20 minutes. They won't kill you quickly, Clara. Hayes specifically requested you be brought back alive." It was an impossible trap, a perfectly executed checkmate by a master manipulator. "Pack your things," Arthur ordered, stepping back and straightening his tie. "You're moving into my compound. The Russians won't dare attack my personal estate. You train there. You eat there. You breathe when I tell you to breathe until the night of the crucible." For the next 2 weeks, Clara became a prisoner in a gilded cage. Arthur's estate, nestled deep in the affluent, heavily wooded suburbs of the North Shore, was a fortress of limestone, steel, and high-tech security. She was given a sprawling guest suite that was larger than the entire bar she used to work in, but she spent all her time in the subterranean, state-of-the-art training facility. The dynamic between Clara and Arthur began to shift, evolving into something highly combustible and deeply confusing. Arthur, largely grounded by his broken ribs, spent his days sitting in a leather armchair in the corner of the gym, watching her. He claimed he was overseeing his investment, but it was an undeniable obsession. He watched her strike the heavy bags for hours on end, mesmerized by the violent, mathematical perfection of her movements. He watched the sweat glisten on her collarbones, the intense, predatory focus in her eyes. She was a beautiful, lethal machine, and Arthur found himself completely captivated by a woman who didn't fear him, who didn't want his money, and who could literally kill him with her bare hands. Clara, in turn, found herself hyper-aware of his gaze. She hated him for blackmailing her, yet she couldn't ignore the raw, magnetic pull of his presence. He wasn't like the sloppy, brutish men she had fought before. Arthur possessed a dark, calculating intelligence. During their forced dinners in the massive, echoing dining room, they engaged in sharp, verbal sparring matches, dissecting fight strategies, psychology, and the brutal realities of their respective worlds. The boiling point arrived on a Tuesday evening, exactly 10 days before the crucible. Arthur had insisted on taking Clara to a highly exclusive, heavily guarded underground tailor in the city to be fitted for a gown. The cover story to the other syndicates was that she was his new mistress, a smokescreen to hide her true purpose as his champion. They were in the back room of the tailor shop, surrounded by bolts of crimson silk and black velvet. Clara was standing on a small pedestal, wearing a breathtaking, backless, emerald green dress that clung to her athletic physique like a second skin. It highlighted the lean, corded muscles of her back and the sharp curve of her hips. Arthur stood in the doorway, a glass of scotch in his hand, completely struck dumb. The brutal street fighter was gone. In her place was an impossibly elegant, lethal goddess. "It's too tight around the lats," Clara complained, rolling her shoulders uncomfortably. "I can't throw a proper hook in this if I need to." Arthur slowly walked toward her, setting his glass down on a velvet chair. "You aren't supposed to throw hooks at a syndicate gala, Clara. You're supposed to look devastating." He stepped up onto the edge of the pedestal, invading her personal space. He reached out, his large, warm hands gently tracing the line of the silk over her ribs. Clara's breath hitched, a sudden, unfamiliar jolt of electricity shooting down her spine. The air in the small dressing room grew incredibly thick, the tension shifting violently from antagonistic to deeply, dangerously sexual. "You look—" Arthur's voice was a low, rough whisper, his eyes dropping to her lips. He completely forgot about the bratva, the tournament, and the power games. He was drawn to her like a moth to an open flame. Before Clara could process the sudden shift, before she could push him away or pull him closer, the front window of the tailor shop exploded in a deafening shower of shattered glass and twisted metal. The concussive shockwave of the blast hit a microsecond before the deafening roar of automatic gunfire ripped through the serene, velvet-lined tailor shop. The massive, reinforced storefront window instantly pulverized into a lethal, glittering cloud of hyper-velocity shrapnel. Arthur Blackwood reacted with the ingrained, violent instincts of a man who had survived a dozen assassination attempts. But Clara was faster. She was the Iron Ghost, a woman whose entire nervous system was hardwired for extreme, sudden violence. Before Arthur could even pivot, Clara lunged forward, her lean legs driving off the wooden pedestal. She tackled his 6'2" frame directly in the center of his chest, hurling them both violently behind a massive, solid oak cutting table, just as a continuous volley of 7.62 mm rounds shredded the exact spot where they had been standing. The exquisite emerald green silk dress tore at the seam as she hit the hardwood floor, her body covering his, shielding his head from the raining destruction. The air instantly filled with the suffocating acrid stench of cordite, burning fabric, and atomized plaster. Mannequins exploded into fiberglass splinters as the expensive bolts of Italian wool and French silk were ripped to shreds by the relentless, sweeping gunfire from the street. "Stay down!" Clara barked, rolling off him, her bare shoulder scraping against a jagged piece of oak. Outside on the rain-slicked pavement, Arthur's heavily armed perimeter guards were caught completely off guard. 2 of his men were instantly cut down in the initial crossfire. The shooters, 4 men wearing dark tactical gear and heavy ballistic masks, were advancing methodically from a black, heavily armored Chevrolet Suburban idling in the intersection. They belonged to the Kozlov Bratva. The heavy cadence of their modified Kalashnikovs was an unmistakable signature. Arthur groaned, a sickening spike of agony radiating from his fractured ribs. He reached blindly inside his ruined suit jacket, his fingers wrapping around the cold, familiar polymer grip of his custom Sig Sauer P226, but his right arm was trembling violently. The impact of Clara's tackle had severely aggravated the bone fractures. "I can't get a clean angle," Arthur gritted his teeth, blood seeping through his white dress shirt. "They have us pinned. If they breach the door, we're dead." Clara looked at his shaking hand, then up at the tactical geometry of the ruined shop. Her eyes were completely cold, filled with the same terrifying, dead-eyed focus she displayed in the boxing ring. She wasn't a waitress hiding from a shootout. She was an apex predator assessing a combat scenario. Without a word, Clara snatched the heavy Sig Sauer from Arthur's trembling grip. "What the hell are you doing?" Arthur hissed, grabbing her wrist. "You're a fighter, not a shooter." "Physics are physics, Blackwood," Clara said flatly, pulling her arm free. She checked the chamber with a sharp rack of the slide. "A bullet is just a punch thrown at 1,200 feet per second. Clara didn't cower behind the oak table. She crawled rapidly on her belly through the shattered glass, the ruined emerald silk trailing behind her. She navigated the labyrinth of toppled mirrors until she reached the heavy steel door of the tailor's private fitting suite. This angle provided a narrow, obscured line of sight directly through a blown-out side window. Through the settling dust, Clara saw the lead Kozlov hitman stepping cautiously over the ruined threshold, his assault rifle raised. He was completely unaware of the lethal shadow crouching in the peripheral darkness. Clara raised the heavy pistol, locking her right arm out perfectly straight to absorb the recoil. She aimed for the unprotected 2-inch gap between his Kevlar helmet and his tactical collar. Crack, crack, a perfectly placed double tap. The lead hitman dropped like a stone. Before the second hitman could even register his partner's death, Clara shifted her hips, snapping the barrel 3 degrees to the right. Crack, crack. The second man collapsed backward into the street, his rifle clattering against the pavement. The remaining 2 shooters, realizing they were walking into a highly trained, fatal funnel, immediately laid down a blind, suppressive wall of fire and frantically retreated to their idling Suburban. Tires screeched violently as the massive vehicle tore off down the wet avenue. Clara slowly lowered the smoking weapon. Her hands were perfectly steady. She walked back to the oak table, her bare feet bleeding from microscopic glass cuts, and looked down at Arthur. He stared at her in absolute shock. The woman he thought he had figured out had just executed 2 heavily armored cartel hitmen with the icy precision of a military operative. "You really need to start paying me more," Clara said quietly, dropping the empty pistol onto his chest. 30 minutes later, they were in the heavily armored, soundproof rear cabin of Arthur's secondary extraction vehicle, speeding back toward his estate. The atmosphere was thick, suffocating, and incredibly volatile. Arthur sat slumped against the leather seat, his face a terrifying mask of barely contained fury. The underground Taylor was an off-the-books location. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a profound betrayal from within his own syndicate. Clara sat across from him, holding gauze against a bleeding gash on her collarbone. "Someone sold you out," she stated. Arthur's blue eyes snapped to hers. "Only 3 men knew we were going there tonight. Elias, Dr. Fowler, and Cole." "It's Cole," Clara said immediately. Arthur frowned. "Why are you so certain?" "Because of how he moves," Clara explained, her voice dropping into the analytical tone of the Iron Ghost. "When you broke my door down, his safety was engaged. In the warehouse, his eyes tracked the exits, not you. He's an opportunist, and tonight he was supposed to be in the front seat of our car. He wasn't." Arthur processed the tactical breakdown, his jaw clenching. He knew she was right. The Russians had likely offered Cole a massive payday. "I'm going to skin him alive," Arthur whispered. "You can't," Clara countered sharply. "If you kill him now, the Kozlovs will know you survived and regroup. You need to let him think his betrayal is still a secret." Arthur leaned forward, ignoring the searing pain in his chest. He looked at Clara in her torn, blood-stained silk dress. She was the most dangerous, beautiful creature he had ever encountered. "Why are you helping me, Clara?" Arthur asked, his voice low and intimate. "You could have let them kill me, taken the gun, and vanished." Clara looked away, not wanting to admit the truth. "Because if the Kozlovs kill you, my immunity deal dies with you." It was a logical answer. It was also a complete lie. Arthur saw right through it. He reached across the space, his bruised hand gently grasping her chin, forcing her to look at him. His thumb brushed softly against her lower lip. "You're a terrible liar, Clara," Arthur murmured. The heavy SUV hit a pothole, the sudden jolt throwing Clara slightly forward. Arthur caught her, pulling her flush against his chest. The collision of their bodies was like dropping a lit match into gasoline. Arthur crushed his mouth against hers in a raw, desperate kiss. Clara didn't pull away. She grabbed fistfuls of his ruined jacket, kissing him back with an equally terrifying hunger. She tasted blood, scotch, and overwhelming power. For the first time in 3 years, the Iron Ghost didn't feel the need to hide. The underground air inside the abandoned McCormick Reaper Works was thick, suffocating, and dripping with humid anticipation. The decaying industrial plant had been transformed into a modern-day Roman Colosseum for the decennial crucible. Over 500 of the most dangerous, wealthy criminals in North America filled the makeshift bleachers surrounding a massive, ropeless fighting pit. Millions of dollars in illegal wages changed hands beneath the harsh halogen lights. High above, in a glass-enclosed supervisor's office, sat Ivan Kozlov, the massive patriarch of the Kozlov Bratva. He looked down at the empty pit with a smug, arrogant smile, convinced his champion, Grigori, would slaughter whatever pathetic offering Arthur Blackwood brought to the table. Arthur stood in the shadows of the concrete tunnel, dressed in a flawless midnight black tuxedo, looking completely unbothered despite his fractured ribs. Cole stood nervously to his right, sweating profusely under the dim lights. "Where is she, boss?" Cole asked, his voice tight. "If we forfeit, we lose the South Port." "Patience, Cole," Arthur said smoothly, not even glancing at the traitor. "She knows exactly when to make her entrance." A deafening roar erupted from the Bratva side. Grigory had entered. Standing 6'6" and weighing 270 pounds of pure, heavily tattooed muscle, he was a terrifying spectacle. He raised his taped fists and let out a guttural roar that vibrated the rusted metal walkways. Ivan Kozlov laughed, grabbing the PA microphone. "Blackwood, is this a joke? Do you want us to provide a coffin or a matchbox?" Arthur stepped to the edge of the pit with a dark smirk. "Just ring the damn bell, Ivan." From the opposite tunnel, Clara Hastings walked out. The arena fell into a bizarre silence before erupting into deafening, mocking laughter. She looked incredibly small against the backdrop of industrial decay. Dressed in simple black combat shorts and a sports bra, her hands meticulously wrapped in white tape, she walked with a perfectly balanced gait. Her eyes were devoid of fear, locked onto the towering monster waiting for her. Clara didn't tap gloves. She dropped her center of gravity, shifting her weight onto the balls of her feet, raising her guard. The iron ghost was fully awake. Clang! Grigory didn't bother with technique. He rushed forward like an enraged silverback, swinging a massive, looping right hook designed to decapitate her. Clara vanished. She executed a flawless, blindingly fast slip, letting the air-displacing punch fly harmlessly over her shoulder. Using his own immense momentum, she stepped deep inside his guard, planted her feet, and twisted her hips with explosive torque. Crack! Her taped fist dug viciously into the soft tissue below Grigory's ribcage. A perfect liver shot. The massive Russian gasped, his momentum abruptly halting. But Grigory was a monster. He didn't drop. Roaring in fury, he blindly swung, his massive left elbow backward in a desperate arc. The elbow caught Clara glancingly on the cheekbone. The blunt force impact was catastrophic. She was violently lifted off her feet, crashing heavily onto the unforgiving concrete. The arena erupted. Cole let out a slow, relieved breath, his hand inching towards the concealed weapon under his jacket. He knew Arthur was distracted by the sight of Clara falling limp. This was his moment to finish the contract for the Kozlovs. "She's done, boss," Cole whispered, stepping directly behind Arthur, drawing his suppressed pistol and aiming it at the base of Arthur's spine. "And so are you." Arthur didn't even turn his head. He had been waiting for this exact moment. With terrifying speed, entirely ignoring his fractured ribs, Arthur violently spun. His left hand shot out, brutally slapping the barrel of Cole's pistol upward just as the traitor pulled the trigger. The bullet buried itself harmlessly into the ceiling. Simultaneously, Arthur's right hand formed a rigid knife edge, driving viciously into Cole's larynx. As Cole collapsed, gagging, Arthur seamlessly drew his own Sig Sauer and pressed it against Cole's forehead. "You always were a sloppy second, Cole," Arthur hissed coldly. Down in the pit, Clara's vision swam. She tasted her own blood and saw Grigory's massive boots stepping closer, ready to stomp her skull into the concrete. Through the haze, she glanced toward the edge of the pit and saw Arthur holding a gun to his lieutenant's head. He had known about the betrayal. He had protected her flank. A violent surge of adrenaline flooded Clara's system. She wasn't fighting for survival anymore. She was fighting for her empire. As Grigory raised his boot for the killing blow, Clara rolled violently to her right, avoiding it by millimeters. In a continuous motion, she sprang upward, launching her body off the floor. She wrapped her strong legs entirely around Grigory's extended right thigh, hooking her ankles tightly behind his knee. Grabbing his ankle, she arched her back, applying scientifically perfect leverage against the vulnerable joint. Snap! The sound of Grigory's ACL and MCL rupturing echoed like a gunshot. The giant roared in primal agony, crashing to the concrete like a demolished building. Before he could recover, Clara scrambled up his massive back. She wrapped her right arm tightly around his thick neck, sinking her forearm across his carotid artery, and locked in a flawless rear-naked choke. Grigory thrashed violently, his sheer strength threatening to break her grip. But Clara squeezed with the terrifying power of a python. She buried her face against his neck, cutting off the blood flow to his brain. 10 seconds, his thrashing weakened. 20 seconds, his massive arms dropped limply. 30 seconds, the terrifying beast of the Kozlov Bratva was completely unconscious. Klara held the choke for 5 more seconds to ensure he was subdued before releasing her grip. She stood up, her chest heaving, her face smeared with blood. She stood over the fallen giant, the undisputed champion of the Crucible. The arena was terrifyingly silent. 500 hardened criminals stared in paralyzing disbelief. Up in his glass box, Ivan Kozlov's face drained of color. He had just lost his greatest weapon and the most lucrative port in the Midwest. Arthur holstered his weapon, leaving a gagging coal to his loyal guards. He stepped down into the arena, walking directly to the center, completely ignoring the shocked stares of the rival syndicates. He reached out gently, wiping a streak of blood from Clara's bruised cheekbone. "You won," Arthur said, his voice filled with a profound reverence. "The Kozlovs will honor the treaty. Reginald Hayes is a dead man walking. You're completely free, Clara. You have your life back." Clara looked at the brutal Mafia boss who had upended her existence. She looked at the power in his eyes and the terrifying connection binding them. She didn't want to hide anymore. She reached out, grabbing the lapels of his ruined tuxedo jacket, pulling him down and ignoring the criminal underworld watching their every move. "I don't want my old life back, Arthur," Clara whispered fiercely against his lips, the iron ghost finally claiming her true place in the world. "I want half of yours." Arthur smiled, a dark, victorious smirk. "It's a deal, partner. If you loved this intense dive into the dark, twisted world of Arthur and Clara, you won't want to miss what happens next. The underground is never quiet for long, and their reign as the new king and queen of the Chicago Syndicate is just beginning." What did you think of the Iron Ghost's epic showdown against the Kozlov's giant? Drop a comment below with your favorite moment from the story. Creating these massive, immersive Mafia romance dramas takes a lot of time and passion, and your support means the absolute world to me. If you want more gripping stories filled with ruthless action, shocking betrayals, and slow-burn romance, please smash that like button, share this video with your fellow audiobook and drama lovers, and hit subscribe to join our growing community. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you never miss a new upload. See you in the next chapter.